Welcome to Sleepy Owl. In the mid-1100s along the winding Onon River, a boy was born into a nation of horsemen. His worth, from his first breath, would be measured in the strength of his mount, the loyalty of his kin, and the courage in his heart. Old tales speak of a sign at his birth, a small fist clenched tightly around a dark, hardened knot. A prophecy, some said, of a future painted in struggle and strength. Whether the story was woven later or born in that moment, the life that unfolded would give such legends solid ground. His name was Temüjin. His family, the Borjigin, traced their lineage back to mythic ancestors, the blue-gray wolf and the fallow doe. His father, Yasuji, was a minor chieftain, a man who led his small band across the eastern valleys, living by the hunt, the raid, and the trade. His mother, Hoelin, came from different stock. She had been promised to another, a man of the Merkit people, but Yasuji had seen her and taken her during a journey. By the harsh customs of the steppe, this was not mere cruelty but a move in the endless game of alliance and retribution. Hoelin adapted, her spirit proving to be the steel that would later save her family. The boy's very name was a lesson in the politics of the plains. Yasuji had recently overcome a Tatar warrior named Temüjin. In victory, he bestowed the captive's name upon his newborn son. The Tatars were old adversaries, aligned with the powerful Jin dynasty far to the south. To carry a defeated enemy's name was a constant, subtle declaration, a reminder of fleeting victories and eternal rivalry. A father's pride, etched into a cradle. The grassland was his first and most demanding tutor. He could ride almost before he could walk, clinging to the shaggy mane of a Mongolian pony. He learned to read the land like a page, the distant shimmer that meant a herd of gazelle, the specific sound of a river's current hinting at its depth, the suspicious stillness on a far ridge that spoke of watching men. In a world of felt tense, hunger was a familiar shadow at the edge of the firelight. Seasons dictated life: spring births, summer migrations to richer pastures, autumn hunts and raids, and a watchful, hushed winter where enemies could emerge from the white horizon. There were no formal schools, no written lessons. His education was written in the weather, in the temperament of animals, and in the moods of men. His first true step into the web of alliances came with a promised marriage. When he was around 9, his father arranged a union with Borte, a girl from the Ongjarat tribe, who controlled fertile lands along the Kurlan River. It was a strategic bond, linking families and futures. Following tradition, Yasuji left his son with the Ongjarat for a time, to live among his future kin. On his journey home, Yasuji paused to eat with a group of Tatars. They recognized him and they poisoned his food. He made it back to his own camp, but the poison did its slow, fatal work. The death of a leader often meant the end of his clan. Loyalties dissolved when there was no strong hand to hold them. The Takyid, who had followed Yasuji, saw only a widow and a boy. They took what herds and goods they could and abandoned Hoelin and her children to the mercy of the merciless steppe. The bitterness of those years is preserved in song and story. Hoelin led her children to the riverbanks, digging for edible roots, teaching them to set snares for marmots and mice. They fished through holes cut in the thick ice. They learned to sleep with one ear open, to hide their few precious horses. The line between another day and a silent end was as thin as the weight of a single, luckily caught bird. This relentless schooling etched itself into Temüjin's soul. It taught him that blood ties could be broken, that loyalty was a choice, not an obligation. It showed him that a small, determined group could withstand what was meant to shatter them. It revealed a world where mercy was a rarer commodity than meat in the deepest winter, forcing him to begin building his own web of trust, person by person. That web started with unexpected threads. There was the story of a simple herdsman named Sorkin. The Takyid had captured the teenage Temüjin, placing a heavy wooden kang around his neck, parading him as a prize. During a noisy feast, Temüjin broke free and fled to the shelter of a river. Sorkin found him hiding in the reeds. He could have won favor by returning the fugitive. Instead, he hid the boy in his own family's cart, risking everything. Years later, When Temüjin commanded thousands, he remembered. He lifted the herdsman's family to honor. A private rule was forged in that memory. Never forget those who aid you when you have nothing. Another thread was a young man named Boworshu. Temüjin had his few horses stolen. While tracking them, he met Boworshu, who joined the pursuit without hesitation. They rode through the night, recovered the animals, and when Temüjin offered a reward, Boworshu asked for none. He simply stayed. He would become a commander of unwavering faith. Others came, Jelm, who would later tend a grave wound. These were the first strands. The pattern was becoming clear. Temüjin's early circle was built on personal debt, proven courage, and visible fairness, not on the ancient scrolls of noble ancestry. But even the closest circle could fracture under strain. A bitter conflict arose between Temüjin and his half-brother, Bektar, during a desperate season. The fight was over scraps of food and the right to command within their starving family. In a moment of brutal decision, Temüjin and his full brother Khazar ambushed Bektar and killed him. Hoylan was furious, her curses painting a dark picture for her sons. They had turned on their own shadow. This harsh moment became a cornerstone of his moral understanding. He had learned the weight of crossing a line that even his fierce mother would not forgive. Later in life, holding the power of life and death over rivals, he would sometimes recall that lesson and choose a different path. Not always, and never softly, but with a restraint that often surprised his foes. And then there was Jamuka, a friendship that began in boyhood, sharing games, sharing a bowl of milk. They swore the ancient oath of Anda, making them blood brothers, pledging to share all things equally. In youth, it meant shared dreams under a single blanket. In the years to come, that sacred bond would become the ultimate test of ambition, a story of brotherhood, divergence, and a fate neither could have foreseen on the sun-drenched grasslands of their childhood. While Temüjin gathered his first loyal companions, his eyes were also learning to read the wider chessboard of the steppe. He observed the powerful Karaite tribe and their leader, Turul, whom the Chinese called Wang Khan. He watched the Naiman to the west and the ever-present Tatars to the southeast. He understood the schemes of the distant Jin dynasty, which stoked conflict among the tribes to keep them weak and divided. Survival, he realized, would require more than a small band of friends. It needed the shelter of a powerful patron, a stepping stone to a grander alliance. The opportunity arrived in the form of a wedding gift. When Temüjin came of age, he traveled to the Anggerat to finally bring Borte, his promised wife, home. Her family honored the old agreement, sending the couple off with a dowry. Among the treasures was a coat of supreme quality, woven from the pelts of black sables. It was a fortune in fur. Temüjin did not keep it. Instead, he turned his mount and rode to the camp of Turul, the Karaite lord. He presented the magnificent coat as a gift, and in doing so, presented himself. He spoke of the old friendship between Turul and his late father, Yasujii, and asked to be taken in as a son. The older Khan accepted both the gift and the man. He called Temüjin his son and promised his protection and support. It was a masterstroke, a political alliance secured not by force of arms, but by the shrewd application of memory, respect, and a single, priceless object. This bond with Turul provided more than just a safe harbor. It offered a front-row view of statecraft. The Karaite were Nestorian Christians at court and seasoned traders with the northern edges of China. Their camp was a crossroads where envoys from settled empires came with demands and bribes. Temüjin watched intently. He observed how a Khan received messengers, how he distributed rewards, how he settled disputes. He saw the machinery of a larger polity at work, understanding that a true leader could be more than just the boldest raider. He absorbed these lessons, storing them away. There was a spiritual dimension to him as well, often buried later beneath the image of the conqueror. Chronicles tell of a moment of terror on the slopes of the sacred mountain, Burkhan Khaldun. Pursued by enemies, he climbed for his life and vowed that if the mountain protected him, he would honor it forever. He later decreed the peak sacred, forbidding any desecration. This reveals a young man who believed deeply in the eternal blue sky, who held that oaths were threads woven into fate itself, and that to break them was to unravel one's own fortune. His future, famous insistence on the safety of envoys and the sanctity of agreements grew from this very soil. In these formative years, he honed the language of steppe warfare. He mastered the art of the feigned retreat, luring pursuers into a deadly trap. He learned to use terrain as a weapon, to communicate across vast distances with signals of smoke and flags. He had no heavy infantry, no siege towers, no written manuals. What he possessed was a nimble, strategic mind that could see how a small skirmish could be turned into a decisive victory. His primary weapon was the composite bow, a masterpiece of layered horn, sinew, and wood. Short enough to fire from a galloping horse, yet powerful enough to pierce armor from a shocking distance. A rider could hang off the side of his saddle, becoming a fleeting, difficult target while letting loose a fatal arrow. A boy's game became a man's art of war. The world beyond the whispering grass was still a land of rumor. Chinese traders brought bolts of silk and tales of immense walls that crawled over mountain spines. Muslim merchants spoke of cities so vast a market could never be fully explored. For now, these were just stories to warm a cold night. Temüjin's reality was more immediate. Keep the horses healthy, keep his family fed, keep his friends close, and win a few more. The first chapter of his epic does not end with a crown. It ends in a felt tent, under hides, with a wife beside him and the precious sable coat now in another man's hands. Borshu and Jelm shared a meal, speaking of journeys to come. Somewhere in the surrounding darkness, his blood brother Jamuka thought of their oath and the days when they would ride together again. The boy who had learned to dig roots from frozen ground was beginning to master a far more complex art, the careful arrangement of people, placing loyalties and alliances as deliberately as he once set his snares for rabbits. The wind sighed against the gur, its whisper a soft approval. But dawn on the steppe holds no promises. It can be gentle or it can be merciless. On one morning, etched forever in memory, it was merciless. Temüjin's camp was quiet, nestled in a fold of land near the Onon River. The last threads of smoke from night fires faded into a cold, pale sky. Horses grazed at the edge of the light. The guards felt at ease they should not have trusted. The Merkit riders came with the dawn. They came like a sudden storm, a dark wave born of an old grievance, the abduction of Hoyilin years before. This was their delayed vengeance. They came for blood and for women. The smaller camp was overwhelmed. Temüjin fought a desperate rearguard, then broke away with a handful of men, driving his horses toward the sanctuary of Burkhan Khaldun. Borde could not escape. She was taken, along with other women, carried north toward the Merkit pastures. The old story of abduction had returned to haunt the Borjigin, this time as a searing wound, not a calculated bargain. In the rough sanctuary of the sacred mountain, surrounded by birch and stone, Temüjin made his plea to heaven and earth. He renewed his vow to the mountain. Then he sent word to the two men whose answers would define his future. One was Turul, the foster father who had accepted the sable coat. The other was Jamuka, the sworn brother of his youth. The calls of pledged kinship and sworn oath carried immense weight on the steppe when the debt was so clear. And both men answered. What followed was Temüjin's first experience of commanding a large, combined force. The Karait arrived in strength. Jamuka brought a tide of riders from his own alliance. Temüjin, still a minor leader, added his own band. Together, they became a single arrow, tracking the raiders across rivers and through valleys choked with willow. The Merkit, believing themselves safe among kin, had grown complacent. Complacency is a fatal luxury on the open plains. The Allied force found their camp and struck with speed and fury. Arrows filled the air like a sudden, deadly rain. The Merkit line shattered, men scattering along the waterways. Borde was found and brought back to Temüjin's arms. Hoyilin's younger sister was also rescued. In that moment of recovery and shared victory, the alliances that would shape the next decade were tempered in gratitude and triumph. The camp that formed afterward was a living academy. The Karait brought their court scribes, their armored guards, their Christian priests, and messengers who knew the trails to the Jin frontier. Jamuka's men carried the confident swagger of long, noble pedigrees. Temüjin's circle was smaller, built on a different kind of faith, one earned, not inherited. For a time, the three camps intertwined. They hunted together, feasted from common cauldrons, and told tales that burnished old legends and forged new ones. It was during these months that the birth of a son, Joki, lit a quiet, slow-burning fuse. Borde had been among the Merkit long enough for doubt to seed itself, for whispers to wind through the gossip that forever swirls in a nomad camp. Temüjin publicly accepted Joki as his own, treating him as his firstborn in every way. Yet the whisper never fully died. In years to come, brothers would wield that rumor like a blade. For now, the child's life was a symbol of the family's survival against a blow that could have ended their story. There were more practical lessons to be learned in this allied camp. Temüjin was a keen observer. He watched how Tural held court, receiving delegations and making swift judgments. He studied the patrols that fanned out from the Karait tents, the signals they used to warn of strangers on a distant ridge. He saw how Jamuka maintained the loyalty of his noble followers with gifts and favor, and how he could lose their respect with a careless word. He witnessed how quickly camaraderie could curdle into envy when one man's star rose too brightly for another's liking. Such close gatherings, fueled by shared victory, cannot last. They always end with the decision to part before jealousy breaks the bond. Temüjin chose to strike his own tent, to move his household away from the orbit of his foster father and his blood brother. The women closest to him counseled this move. Hoilan possessed an unerring instinct for the moment when gratitude became a leash. Borte, who would prove to be a calm strategist in private, agreed. Temüjin and Jamuka exchanged the warm words of brotherhood, but beneath the pleasantries lay a friction that further proximity would only sharpen. When Temüjin gave the order to move, something remarkable happened. 41 households of proven warriors and their families chose to follow him. They did not do this for promises of gold or out of fear. They followed because they had watched how he divided spoils, how he kept his word, and how he judged disputes. They preferred that clear, merit-based fairness to the old, entrenched games of lineage and privilege. This voluntary exodus made the simmering tension with the old guard an open reality. A careful dance followed. Camps shifted across the landscape, each leader calculating pastures, water sources, and the drifting allegiances of other tribes. Rivals watched and plotted. The Tatars, sometimes favored by the Jin as a counterweight, kept a wary distance. The Teikid, who had once abandoned Hoilan, had not forgotten the young man they had hunted. The Merkit smoldered, seeking new allies. All the while, Temüjin worked on the ground beneath his feet. He organized his companions into squads that could act independently. He created small units of 10 and 100, deliberately mixing men from different clans and families. He did this in miniature long before he possessed the authority to impose such a system on every tribe. The revolutionary habit of breaking ancient bloodlines and forging new bonds based on service and loyalty began here, in these tentative formations. War finally announced itself at a place remembered as Dallin Baljet. Jamuka commanded the larger force, backed by the weight of older, prestigious names. He had also rallied a coalition of clans who feared what Temüjin represented, a world where a herdsman's son could outrank a prince. They fought to preserve the old order, where privilege was served at every feast. When the two hosts clashed, the sky swarmed with hunting birds and the earth trembled under countless hooves. Temüjin's men fought with ferocity but were outnumbered. He was wounded and escaped with his life by a narrow margin. Jamuka was not content with mere victory. To cement his triumph and his terrifying authority, he ordered captured leaders boiled alive and others mutilated. This calculated cruelty left a mark deeper than any battlefield defeat. Men who had followed Jamuka out of respect for his lineage felt a cold shame and a new fear. In the months that followed, some began to drift away from his camp, finding their way to Temüjin's tents, where they were received, their pasts forgiven, and their skills put to use. Temüjin did not succumb to despair after Dallin Baljet. He did what he had always done. He moved, he listened, and he rebuilt. Some accounts suggest he may have spent time within the lands of the Jin dynasty during this period, perhaps as a mercenary, perhaps as a prisoner who negotiated his way into usefulness. Chinese records later noted a Mongol chieftain who returned to the steppe with a sharper understanding of the world beyond it. Whether this was Temüjin or a close lieutenant, the effect was the same. When he re-emerged with purpose, he carried a deeper comprehension of the immense power seated across the frontier and how its complex politics could be manipulated to his advantage. By the middle of the 1190s, the map of the steppe was ready to be redrawn. Temüjin began to settle old scores with a brutal, yet calculating, hand. He turned his focus to the Tatars, the long-standing source of his family's grief. In a campaign that swept through their pastures like fire through dry grass, he shattered their power. He executed their resisting chiefs and folded their common warriors and families into his own growing following. It was during this campaign that a captured archer confessed to having once shot Temüjin's horse out from under him in battle. Instead of ordering his death, Temüjin admired the man's honesty and skill. He spared him, giving him a new name, Jib, the Arrow. This former enemy would become one of history's most brilliant and daring commanders, a master of terrain and surprise whose name would spread terror from Manchuria to the Danube. Concurrently, Temüjin used his connection to Tural to solidify his position. A faction had risen against the aging Karaite ruler. Temüjin rode to his foster father's aid, crushed the rebellion, and left the Karaite throne more secure. The act pleased Tural, much as a father is pleased by a capable son. But it also raised jealous murmurs among those who watched the younger man's prestige grow with every success. On the steppe, prestige is as dangerous as it is essential. It draws men, but it also draws a target. His connection to the Jin court continued to be a useful tool. In 1196, the Jin turned on some rebellious Tatar groups and called on steppe allies for a punitive campaign. Temüjin answered. He fought effectively, sent the required grim proof of his service, and in return received an honorary title and gifts. This brief, pragmatic alignment with a sedentary empire confused some of his enemies and impressed others, who saw in it the mark of a leader who could navigate different worlds without apology. Temüjin took what he needed from the alliance and gave only what cost him little. Around this time, his own household grew more complex. His sons by Borte were coming of age, learning the rudiments of command on their own small ponies. Joki, despite the shadow of rumor, showed early courage and a surprising generosity. Chagatai revealed a stern, uncompromising sense of justice. Ogidi possessed a natural gift for diplomacy, able to calm quarrels before they hardened. Talyui, the youngest, burned with an intensity that men noticed even in his boyhood. Temüjin watched his sons as closely as he watched his officers, arranging strategic marriages to bind other tribes to his family's destiny. He listened to Borte's private counsel and to Hoilin's famously blunt truths. The old friendship with Jamuka did not vanish. Messages passed between them, efforts made to recapture the simplicity of their shared youth. But the steppe rarely allows such wishes to bloom. Jamuka could not accept a world where men of low birth stood as equals beside princes. Temüjin would not return to the stifling hierarchy of the past. Their paths diverged, even as their words sometimes reached for reconciliation. Defections continued to erode the old order. Men haunted by the memory of the boiling pots at Dallin Baljit sought a camp where justice, however harsh, felt cleaner. Others came after a personal slight from a prideful chief. Some were drawn by a shaman's prophecy, others by the simple desire for their sons to rise higher than they ever could. Temüjin welcomed them with a measured hand, distributing them across his mixed units, ensuring no man served only alongside his cousins. This decision, seemingly administrative, was quietly building the skeleton of a new world. The years around the turn of the century were a crucible. Temüjin had tasted defeat, retreated, learned, and returned stronger. He had bound himself to a powerful patron and begun to understand that a patron could be both a shield and a future obstacle. He had saved his wife and his honor with borrowed strength and repaid that debt with service. He had turned enemies into his finest commanders and whispers of doubt into a discipline of loyalty. He had begun to speak less of personal vengeance and more of a greater work. A purpose that transcended the endless, small-scale cycles of raid and retribution. The steppe was not yet ready to accept that work, but men had begun to listen to the idea. In a camp on a late autumn night, Temüjin sat in council with Borshu, Jelm, Jeeb, and a handful of grizzled elders. Firelight carved islands of flickering faces from the surrounding darkness. They debated where to move when the first snows fell. Which tribe had grown brittle and might split? Which ally would hold firm if forced to choose between ancient pride and a new, compelling promise? Outside, a young rider in a threadbare coat stood holding 2 horses, waiting for the order to carry messages into the vast night. He did not know he would ride for a nation that did not yet exist. He knew only that the bitter cold seemed to bite a little less when a man stood close to the warm, solid bulk of his horse. The years following the rescue of Borte were a slow, grinding ascent. Power on the steppe accumulates like the turning of seasons. A leader gathers households and loyalties one by one. He must prove he can feed men through the lean winter and enrich them in the fat summer. He must show his word is iron, even when fortune turns cold. In such a world, reputation travels faster than any single rider. By the turn of the century, Temüjin's name was in many mouths. Jamuka's victory at Dalen Baljit had not ended their contest, it had refined it. Warriors remembered the boiling captives, the mutilations. Such acts declare a philosophy of rule, and many who had respected Jamuka's pedigree began to look at Temüjin's camp with new eyes. They found a different atmosphere there. A man of humble birth could sit close to the fire if he had served with valor. Spoils were divided by contribution, not by ancestry. Disputes were settled with a clear, impartial hand. It was not a gentle camp, but it was a clear one. And that clarity was a magnet for those weary of the old games of noble sleight. Temüjin rebuilt with a hunter's patience. He raided where it served a strategic purpose and parleyed where it bought him time. He nurtured his ties with Tural, earning further favor by suppressing another Karaite revolt. In that moment he made the Karaite cause his own, and the old ruler, grateful, reaffirmed him as a son and granted him precious grazing rights. There was genuine affection in this bond, and cold calculation on both sides. Temüjin needed a shelter as he gathered strength. Tural needed a vigorous lieutenant who could bring hard-riding warriors to a fight at a moment's notice. Old enemies were dealt with a ruthless simplicity. The Tatars, who had poisoned his father, finally felt the full weight of Temüjin's long-nursed anger. He struck them in a series of swift, decisive blows that shattered their leadership. He ordered the execution of adult male Tatars who had resisted, an act of vengeance and a stark lesson to all who watched. Their common families and warriors were absorbed and scattered among his own ranks. It was during this final reckoning that the archer Jeeb, the man he had spared, truly entered his service, a decision whose consequences would ripple across continents. By the early 1200s, the steppe had divided into 2 great tides. One flowed with Jamuka and the old aristocracy, who clung to a world where noble blood guaranteed noble standing. The other gathered, sometimes quietly, sometimes with roaring celebration, around Temüjin and the radical idea that talent and loyalty could outrank pedigree. The lines were never perfectly clean. Brothers found themselves on opposite sides. A man might admire Jamuka's princely glamour but be sickened by the spectacle at Dalen Baljit. Another might distrust Temüjin's disregard for tradition but seek his tent because he was tired of being ignored by his own highborn cousins. The steppe is never a simple chessboard. It is a living web of marriages, blood feuds, and minute calculations about grass and water. Rival coalitions formed. Jamuka's supporters proclaimed him Gur Khan, a title heavy with the memory of past steppe empires. They mustered the Tikiad, Nayman allies, and families whose pride had been pricked by the rise of the upstart. Temüjin and Tural stood together, and lesser clans watched to see which wind would prevail. A battle at a place called Koydan tested these alignments. Temüjin and Tural used mobility and patience to wear down the opposition, sending them home with a clear lesson. The new alliance could stand its ground against the oldest of names. The following year, Temüjin finished his work with the Tatars, folding their remaining people into his ranks. He solidified his practice of mixing men from different clans into units of 10 and 100, their loyalty directed upward to the command structure, not sideways to their kin. He did not yet have the power to impose this everywhere, but he practiced it wherever his authority reached. This mixing made it harder for local chieftains to spirit away a troop in a fit of pride and easier for Temüjin to wield his force like a single, disciplined fist. Tension within the Karaite alliance finally crystallized around a marriage proposal. Temüjin suggested his eldest son, Joki, should wed a daughter of Tural, a standard way to cement a partnership. Yet the suggestion touched raw nerves. Whispers about Joki's birth had never fully died, and some Karaite nobles saw the proposal as an insult. Tural's own son, Singum, watched Temüjin's growing fame with jealousy, fearing the younger man's camp would eclipse his own inheritance. Jamuka fed this unease, warning that Temüjin's habit of elevating common men was eroding the very dignity of noble lines. An ambush was plotted to remove Temüjin. But the steppe has ears. Two herdsmen, minds sharpened by a lifetime of listening to the land and the gossip it carries, overheard the plan and carried a frantic warning to Temüjin's tent. He slipped away with his core followers just before the traps snapped shut. What followed were weeks of mortal peril. At the Kalakaljid sands, Temüjin suffered a crushing defeat. His camp was scattered, his family in imminent danger of capture. It seemed the story might end in the oldest of steppe traditions, the victor displaying the relics of the vanquished at his next feast. The escape that saved him, and the oath that followed, have lived in Mongol memory ever since. He gathered a small, desperate band at a brackish lake remembered as Baljuna. Their horses were spent. Their supplies were gone. In an ultimate act of sacrifice, Temüjin slaughtered his own prized mount to feed those who stayed. They mixed the muddy water with mare's milk and shared the bitter draught. There, in the mud, they swore an oath. If heaven allowed them to rise again, they would share all future wealth and hardship and never forget those who stood together in that desolate hour. These men were not of one tribe or even one faith. They were bound by personal loyalty and a promise that a new order would reward service above all. Later chroniclers might downplay this episode, but for the men who lived it, the Baljuna covenant was a foundation stone. These companions would form a trusted cadre for the battles yet to come. Recovery was born from cunning and sheer persistence. Temüjin split his forces, using a feigned retreat to draw Karaite detachments into terrain of his choosing. He struck their flank with men who had waited in concealed positions, pressing the attack until the Karaite line broke. Tural fled and died at the hands of strangers who did not recognize him. Singum rode for a distant refuge. Temüjin absorbed the Karaite people as he had the Tatars. He married into the defeated royal family and arranged marriages that turned former rivals into relatives. A young Karaite woman named Sorgatani entered the family here. She would one day shape the destinies of empires through her own grandsons. With the Karaite confederation shattered, only the Nayman alliance stood as a serious barrier to Temüjin's dominance. The Nayman looked west as well as east, with contacts into the settled realms beyond the Altai Mountains. Their leader, Genghis Khan, was brave but indecisive. With him was a younger prince, Kuklug, all nerve and little judgment. Jamuka had found shelter among them and urged them to strike before Temüjin's momentum became unstoppable. The final clash came in the high country. Temüjin's army had now adapted to larger-scale operations. Scouts rode far ahead, flag signals and smoke carried orders across wide fronts. The core remained the mounted archer, able to deliver a storm of arrows before closing with lance and saber. The Nayman fought fiercely, trying to draw him into rough ground to negate his cavalry's edge. Jeeb and Khazar probed the enemy line, found its soft points, and broke through. The battle lasted for days. When the Nayman broke, they broke completely. Genghis Khan fell. Kuklug fled west with a handful of followers. Jamuka slipped away into the hills, a ghost from a fading past. The Nayman people, like the Karaite and Tatars before them, were folded into the growing body of those who now called Temüjin their Khan. The final scene of the rivalry with Jamuka is one of the most poignant and revealing in the entire saga. Jamukha's own followers, hoping to buy favor with the rising power, betrayed him and brought him bound before Temüjin. In a stunning act that defined his code, Temüjin ordered the execution of the traitors for the crime of breaking their bond to their lord. Loyalty, even to a rival, mattered more to him than easy gain. He then turned to his old Anda, his blood brother from childhood. He offered Jamukha forgiveness and a place of honor in the new order if he would accept a subordinate role. Jamukha refused. He could not live in a world he no longer recognized. He asked only for a noble death, one that would not spill his blood upon the earth, the last privilege of a prince. Temüjin, with a heavy heart, granted the request. They spoke one last time as men who remembered sharing a blanket and dreams as boys. And then the old friend was gone. His death closed a chapter that had begun with shared milk in a wooden bowl. The steppe now lay open, united, ready for a work unseen for generations. In the year 1206, by the headwaters of the Onon River, Temüjin summoned a great assembly, a kurultai. The chiefs and elders came, but so did the captains of the new decimal units, men whose rank was earned, not inherited. In a moment of profound transformation, the assembly raised Temüjin high upon a carpet of felt and proclaimed him Genghis Khan. Scholars debate the title's exact meaning. Some say, firm, unyielding ruler, others, ruler of all between the oceans. Whatever its root, its effect was absolute. The man who had survived abandonment, capture, betrayal, and defeat was now the sovereign of a united people. This was not merely a change of title. It was a revolution in the flow of power. He moved decisively to weaken the old, centrifugal pull of the clans and to strengthen the vertical ties to the center. He formalized the decimal organization, units of 10, Arban, 100, Jagan, 1,000, Mingan, and 10,000, Tumun. Warriors from defeated tribes were placed under commanders chosen for merit, so a man no longer rode only beside his cousins. He expanded his personal guard, the Kashig, into both a protective detail and a school of administration. Promising youths from across the realm served there, learning command and governance, ensuring both their loyalty and a pool of future officers. He instituted laws. What would later be called the Yasa was not a single written code, but a living body of decrees and precedents. Theft of livestock was punished severely. Murder within the community meant swift justice. Soldiers were forbidden to abandon comrades. Booty was to be meticulously recorded and divided by clear rules to stifle jealousy. The abduction of women was curtailed. Above all, the person of an envoy was declared sacred. To harm a messenger was to attack the Khan's own order. Religion was not a weapon. Priests, monks, imams, and shamans were to practice in peace, their persons protected. In an empire that would soon span deserts, mountains, and forests, this tolerance was not idealism, it was vital statecraft, as necessary as fodder for the horses. He gave his words wings, creating the Yam, a legendary relay system of postal stations. At each station stood fresh horses, fodder, and dedicated attendants. A courier with a Pesa tablet of authority could demand a remount and shelter, racing orders and news across distances faster than any army could march. Commerce and command walked together. He entered into partnerships with merchants, often Central Asian Ortak, who supplied the army in return for security and trade privileges. These men became the arteries of wealth and intelligence, turning plunder into planned taxation. With orders secured at his back, the new Khan tested the borders. To the southwest lay Western Xia, a Tangut kingdom guarding the nexus of desert, mountain, and the Great Yellow River. In 1209, he returned to Xia with a formidable host. The heart of the realm was the city of Zhongxing, protected by strong walls and the river's curve. The Mongols were masters of the open plain, but walls had humbled many steppe leaders before them. Genghis Khan refused to be humbled. He gathered engineers, Chinese, Khitan, and set them to work. Siege engines were built, stone throwers dragged into position. Chroniclers tell of an attempt to divert the Yellow River to flood the city. The earthworks failed and the waters turned against the besiegers, but the lesson was as valuable as victory. The Khan would use any tool, any skill. After months of relentless pressure, the Xia court sued for terms. They agreed to pay tribute, send hostages, and accept a royal marriage. The Khan accepted their submission and withdrew. He had gained more than treasure. He had secured a quiet frontier and bought priceless time. His gaze now turned to the great weight of the Jin dynasty to the south, whose border cut like a scar across the grasslands. In 1211, he called his commanders for a campaign of a scale no Mongol had attempted in living memory. The army moved toward the passes guarding the northern Chinese plain. Scouts found neglected tracks, bribed guides, used the knowledge of subject peoples. They did not batter the strongest gates. They flowed through the cracks. Once on the plain, the army spread like water, moving with a coordination that baffled their foes. Feigned retreats drew Jin garrisons from their forts into killing grounds where storms of arrows broke them. When the Jin assembled a grand army, the Mongols flowed around it, striking at supply lines. A cavalry that could cover 60 miles in a day became an instrument of strategic paralysis. City after city learned the brutal calculus of Mongol war. Open the gates early, be spared and taxed, resist and cause losses, face exemplary destruction. It was policy, not passion, a calculated use of terror to reduce future costs. At the same time, artisans, clerks, and scholars were often spared and sent north, their skills a treasure the Khan well understood. Not every blow was struck by Chinggis himself. A commander named Mukhali proved to be a pillar of quiet authority, left behind to hold and administer conquered Jin territory with patience and steel, using local officials to keep the granaries and tax rolls functioning. The campaign built legendary reputations. Jeeb the Arrow, spared years before, showed a preternatural feel for the enemy. Subutai, younger and relentlessly analytical, began his rise, studying river courses and mountain passes, thinking in seasons, not days. The Khan's sons rode in separate wings, Joki gaining a name for managing surrendered peoples, Shagatai for severe justice, Ogdi for mediation, Talyui for fierce, focused intensity. The Khan watched them all, taking private counsel from Bort. The question of succession lay like a sealed letter, noted, but not yet opened. The Jin court, reeling, struggled to comprehend this new enemy. They sent massive armies to retake towns, only to find themselves shadowboxing a force that would not stand still. In 1214, a treaty was struck. The Jin promised gifts and to move their court south. The Khan took the gifts and watched. When the Jin broke terms, fleeing south to rebuild, the Mongols returned. In 1215, the Jin central capital, Zhongdu, later Beijing, fell. Fire and sack followed. The city that had believed in its walls learned the cost of resisting a people who kept a ledger of every promise broken. And behind the storm, scribes were already at work, making sense of it all, counting surrendered families, inventorying granaries, learning how to govern what had been conquered. The boy from the Onon was becoming the ruler of the world. The road to the west opened only after Genghis Khan had secured his northern flank and tested his new state against fortified walls. A final loose thread remained. Kuklug, the Nayman prince who had fled westward, had seized control of the Kara Kaitai kingdom, persecuting its Muslim and Buddhist populations. Jeeb was sent with a force so light and fast it seemed to fly across the land. He pursued Kuklug through the Ili Valley, into the high Pamirs, breaking resistance with minimal engagement. Kuklug was run to ground, his brief reign ended. With this, the Mongol frontier now touched the domains of the Khwarezmian Empire, a powerful Muslim state stretching from the Aral Sea to the Persian Gulf. The Shah of Khwarezm, Ala ad-Din Muhammad, ruled a realm rich from the Silk Road but fractured by internal rivalry, particularly with his own formidable mother, Turkan Khatan. Where the Mongol camp had one decisive center, Khwarezm had several, pulling in different directions. Genghis Khan did not begin with a declaration of war. He began with a caravan in 1218, bearing goods and a message of peaceful trade. At the border city of Otrar, the governor, suspecting espionage, seized the caravan, killed the merchants, and confiscated their wealth. The Khan's response was deliberate. He sent a formal embassy to the Shah. demanding redress and reminding him of the sacred law protecting envoys. The Shah, arrogantly or foolishly, allowed the governor to stand. Then he compounded the crime. He had the beards of the Mongol diplomats shaved, a supreme insult, and sent one back with news that the others had been executed. In the Khan's law, this was an unforgivable assault on the world's order itself. The decision for war was now as simple and inevitable as drawing a bowstring to the ear. The campaign that followed was a masterpiece of coordinated annihilation. The forces were divided into precision instruments. Jochi would sweep up the Sir Darya river towns. Chagatai and Ogdi would target the jewels of Transoxiana, Bokhara and Samarkand. Talyui would drive south into Khorasan, and ranging like unleashed falcons between these columns were Jib and Subutai, scouting, cutting communications, and striking where least expected. Otrur, the city where the flame was lit, fell first after a long, grim siege. The governor who had ordered the massacre was captured. Mongol practice was clear: punish the author of the crime. The city was made an example. Jochi methodically secured the river corridor. Then came Bokhara. Its leaders had been divided, hesitant. The Mongols appeared from a direction deemed impassable, having crossed a desert with water in skins. The city's citadel held briefly. Persian chroniclers record that Genghis Khan addressed the people in the Great Mosque, not as a holy man but as the instrument of a punishing heaven. "I am the punishment of God," he is said to have declared. "If you had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like me upon you." Whether apocryphal or not, the meaning was plain. Pride and faithlessness had brought this storm upon them. Then came Samarkand, richer and stronger, with walls manned by a vast garrison and even war elephants. Chagatai and Ogdi encircled it. Chinese and Khitan engineers assembled their counterweight trebuchets. Sappers dug beneath the towers. After days of relentless assault, a portion of the city opened its gates, hoping for mercy. The citadel fought on and was destroyed. The Shah, Muhammad, had already begun a frantic, doomed flight from city to city, always a step behind the avalanche, eventually dying of despair on a barren island in the Caspian Sea. His son, the valiant Jalal ad-Din, would rally later, but for now, the heart of the empire was torn out. The fall of Gurganj, the old capital, revealed fissures within the Mongol family itself. The city, a maze of canals, resisted with terrible courage. Jochi, who had authority over the region, argued for a negotiated surrender to preserve its wealth and people. Chagatai, ever severe, demanded total punishment for the resistance. Their quarrel echoed the old, painful rumor about Jochi's birth. Genghis Khan sent Ogdi to mediate. Ogdi enforced unity of command, but after the city finally yielded, a terrible sack ensued, a concession to Chagatai's harsh justice that left a stain on the victory. Talyui's column then delivered the lesson to Khorasan. The great cities of Merv, Nishapur, and Herat learned the price of resistance. Nishapur, where a Mongol son-in-law was killed during the fighting, suffered a fearsome reprisal. The scale of destruction in these places has been debated for centuries, but the carpet of fear was real, and it was unrolled with cold, strategic intent to make the next city surrender without a fight. While the main armies reduced the urban centers, a drama of unparalleled scope unfolded in the mountains. Jib and Subutai, having completed their primary tasks, requested permission to pursue the fleeing Jalal ad-Din and to conduct a reconnaissance in force to the west. What followed was one of the greatest cavalry raids in history. They circled the Caspian Sea's southern shore, defeated a Georgian army, forced the pass at Derbent, and emerged into the steppes north of the Caucasus. There, they faced an alliance of Cumans and their Alan allies. With brilliant psychological warfare, they convinced the Cumans the Alans would betray them, splitting the alliance before destroying each part separately. The defeated Cumans fled west, into the lands of the Russian principalities, drawing the Mongols after them. At the Khalkha River in 1223, the princes of Kiev and their allies, disunited and overconfident, faced the two Mongol generals. The battle was a masterclass in tactical deception and mobility. feigned retreats drew the Russian lines into disorder, followed by devastating flank attacks. The rout was total. Gebe and Subutai did not stay to conquer. Their mission was reconnaissance. After making a brutal example of captured princes, they turned east, fighting their way back through the Volga region, returning to the Khan with maps in their minds and a profound understanding of the geography and politics of the West. They had ridden a circle of thousands of miles, undefeated. In the wake of the Western campaign came not merely occupation, but administration. Darakachis, civil overseers, were placed in key towns to supervise tax collection and report on local elites. The Yam relay posts extended their threads. Persian clerks worked beside Uyghur scribes. Muslim judges adjudicated under the Mongol seal. The web held because the penalties for breaking it were swift and the profits for respecting it were immense. The unresolved tension between Joki and Chagatai, however, demanded a final settlement. On the banks of the Ili River, Genghis Khan convened a family council. With foresight, he named his third son, Ogdi, as his heir. Not the fiercest warrior, but the one who could reconcile, who could listen, who could keep peace between his stronger-willed brothers. Joki was confirmed as lord of the distant western steppes, the lands as far as the hooves of Mongol horses had trod. Chagatai was given Transoxiana and the role of guardian of the law. Talyui, the youngest, would receive the ancestral homeland and the central army. The settlement was set. Genghis Khan himself moved south for a final confrontation with the rallying Jalal ad-Din. On the banks of the Indus River, they fought a dramatic battle. Jalal ad-Din fought with spectacular courage, but was overwhelmed. In a legendary escape, he spurred his horse off a high bank into the raging river and swam to safety under a hail of arrows. The Khan, watching from a height, openly praised his enemy's spirit. He would have welcomed such a man as a vassal, but pride and the ghost of a dead empire drove Jalal ad-Din into exile in India. The Mongol army, its objective achieved, did not pursue him deep into the subcontinent. It turned for home. The Western War had been a searing education. The Mongols had learned to fight in deserts and walled gardens, to assault fortresses and navigate mountain passes. They had incorporated engineers, artillerymen, and the exquisite skills of captured artisans. They had enriched themselves with a flood of ideas and laden themselves with a legacy of sorrow that Persian poets would mourn for generations. In a winter camp back on the Mongolian steppe, the great captains gathered. Gebe traced routes in the ashes with a stick. Subutai measured distances with his fingers. The sons reported what they had learned. Borte listened, holding her counsel for private moments. Hoilan looked at her grandsons and remembered the years when a single snared rabbit meant survival. Outside, Yam riders changed horses and vanished into the darkness with new orders. The wind carried the scent of dung fires and of cold, hard earth. To the southwest lay a realm that had made peace and then broken its word. The steppe had not finished with it. The greatest test was yet to come. The return from the west was not a return to rest. The empire now had rhythms, a heartbeat of its own. The Kashid Guard had evolved into a school of governance. The Yam posts stretched their nervous system across conquered lands. Uyghur scribes worked with bundles of paper, their inkstones as vital as swords. Persian accountants tallied the ledgers of merchant partners. At the edge of council stood a learned Khitan advisor, Yelu Chukai. He did not plead for mercy, he argued for systematic taxation. You can conquer an empire on horseback, he reportedly said, but you cannot govern it from there. The Khan, a pragmatist above all, listened. He learned not only how to break things, but when to stop breaking them and how to build upon the ruins. The family tent had changed as well. Joki was settled in his western domains, a vast pasture of future conflict and promise. The public quarrel with Chagatai had cooled under the decree naming Ogdi as heir. Talyui remained his father's right hand in war. Borte watched her sons with a strategist's calm. Hoilan, surrounded by grandchildren, saw in the orderly winter camp a miracle born from the memory of hunger. Before the next great movement, the Khan finalized the architecture of his state. The decimal organization became the skeleton of civil administration as well as the army. Leaders of thousands were judges and governors. Darakachis were planted in surrendered cities like steadfast trees, their duty to enforce the promises of the center. If a town had opened its gates early, that fact was recorded and its safety guaranteed. If a merchant had supplied the army, his privileges were renewed. If an official cheated on taxes, his punishment was public and swift. The Yasa was the continuing voice of the ruler, ensuring soldiers felt protected, merchants felt secure, and envoys moved without fear. The campaigns in the West had proven the value of specialists. A corps of engineers now traveled with the army, men who could build a counterweight trebuchet in days, mine beneath a wall, or turn a river's course. Failure was studied, methods were adapted. This relentless, practical curiosity marked the difference between a raider and an empire builder. And now, a final reckoning beckoned to the east. Western Xia, the Tangut kingdom, had bent the knee years before, paid tribute, and given a princess in marriage. But as the Mongol court focused west, the Tangut nobles had grown dismissive, failing to send troops when summoned and treating with the Jin as equals. Worse, they had again violated the sacred law. They had mistreated Mongol envoys. To raise a hand against a messenger was to challenge the divine mandate the Khan believed he held. The decision was made. He would ride east for the last time. The route to the Tangut capital, Zhongxing, led through the harsh corridor of the Gansu corridor, where towns clung to life along thin rivers. Subutai led one wing with orders to spread chaos and cut supply lines. Talyui commanded another. Genghis Khan, now an older man but with undimmed strategic will, led the main force. They chose to move in late autumn and winter, when the desert heat no longer sapped their horses and the cold sharpened their senses. Town after town faced the choice. Those that opened their gates kept their artisans and handed over grain. Those that fired upon envoys heard the dreadful hum of stones from catapults and saw ladders rise against their walls. Subutai severed the arteries connecting towns to the capital. The Tangut court, panicking, sent pleas in all directions and marshaled its last army in the Helan Mountains. The keystone was Lingwu, a fortress city on the Yellow River. To take it was to step into the Tangut heartland. The Mongols applied every lesson learned from China and Khorasan. Sappers undermined towers. Artillery crews concentrated their fire, then shifted it on command to maximize shock. When a breach was opened, assault teams were supported, not abandoned. The fight moved inward like an inexorable tide. When Lingwu fell, the grip on Zhongxing tightened. The defense failed not only from Mongol pressure, but from Tangut disunity. The court was a cacophony of arguing factions. One for flight, one for trusting their mighty walls, one for desperate negotiation. The rulers sent contradictory messages. In the Mongol camp, these words were read for what they were, the fearful chatter of a regime hoping for a miracle. The Khan, who used time as a tool, pressed forward. He pushed past the Helan Mountains and into the great bend of the Yellow River where Zhongxing sat. The city had formidable earthworks and skilled defenders. The Mongol siege lines drew in. The engine park became a forest of timber and tension. Talyui managed the grinding work of the investment. Subutai ensured no relief could break through. The Khan himself rode a slow circuit, speaking to commanders, steadying their resolve. He promised not quick victory, but certain victory. An old story says they tried once more to turn the Yellow River against the walls. The river, untamable, refused. But the attempt revealed the enduring Mongol instinct. If a natural force could be harnessed, it would be tried. When water failed, they used fire. When fire failed, the slow, relentless gnawing of mines and rams continued. During these long months, a blow fell from across the empire that closed one path forever. Word arrived that Joki was dead in his western domains. He had ruled with a measured hand, shown generosity to surrendered peoples, and held the loyalty of many. Yet the rumor of his birth followed him to the grave, tainting the talk of those who had never accepted him. Chagatai and his camp were careful in their mourning. Ogidi spoke softly. Talyui buried himself in the siege work. Genghis Khan received the news and withdrew into a private tent with Borte. They spoke as a man and woman who had outlasted countless trials, who understood that even a Khan could not command the length of a life. When he emerged, his pace did not change. Orders still flowed. The siege did not slow. But those who knew him well saw a new line etched upon his face, a shadow that would not lift. The final act at Zhongxing played out as many sieges do. The court asked for terms. The Khan demanded the Tangut ruler present himself in person to submit. The ruler sent a son and more empty words. The Khan declared this insufficient. Only the man who had broken the oath could make it right. The ruler would not come. The engine spoke again. A section of wall collapsed. Assault ladders, their rungs slick, went up. The city was taken. The last Tangut emperor was captured and executed, his dynasty erased from history. Its best engineers and archives were taken, its court poets scattered to the winds. And during this long investment, an accident wrote the last pages of the Khan's own story. He was no longer the young man chasing gazelle across the flats, though he still hunted to keep his edge. On a hunt, or perhaps during a ride between siege lines, he fell from his horse. Some said it broke bones that healed poorly, others spoke of a fever that found its moment. Later storytellers would weave tales of plots and poisoned love, but the simpler truth is this. His body, forged in a lifetime of hardship, began to fail. He did not call off the siege. He ordered it finished, the Tangut house punished completely. Then he called his sons. He reaffirmed Ogdi as his successor. He instructed them to finish the war against the Jin, to guard the Yam, to protect envoys, to partner with merchants, and to remember the oath of Baljuna, where loyalty had been tested in mud and cold and found true. He spoke to Talyui about holding the center during the succession. He spoke his last private words to Borte. And then, in the summer of 1227, away from the ruined city, perhaps in the cool Lupan Mountains, the breath left him. The Kashid guarded the news as one guards an ember from the wind. The camp functioned as if nothing had changed until the work was done. Then an escort began the long, secret journey north. Legends say they killed every passerby to keep the route secret, that rivers were diverted over the grave, that a forest was planted to guard it. The elders say only that he was taken toward the sacred Burkhan Khaldun, and the place was left unmarked. He had believed a ruler of the steppe needed no stone to tell men where to bow, only their memory and their obedience. The funeral rites were simple, sacred to the people of the grass. The black horsehair standard was furled, the white standard of peace lifted. Horses were led in circles around an unmarked mound. Shamans spoke to the eternal blue sky, asking it to receive the soul that had altered the course of rivers and of nations. Men who had shared the muddy water of Baljuna stood with heads bowed, remembering its taste. Women who had wrapped children against the wind wept for the ruler who had made the roads safe for caravans from horizon to horizon. The horses were turned to the four directions, and the army knew it would ride again, for the dead man had said the work was not a fire to be put out, but a road to be traveled. The world held its breath, waiting to see who would now hold the reins. The empire did not dissolve with the Khan's last breath. It paused as custom demanded, but its mechanisms endured. Macaulay still held northern China with a steady hand. The Jin court had fled south, its power eroding. The army gathered around the family, awaiting the great assembly that would raise Ogdi as their father had willed. In the workshops, engineers cleaned their tools. Scribes tied final reports with cord. The wind moved over the Onon River, past ancient deer stones marking older graves. The steppe absorbs all things, but it would not forget the habit of order now planted in its soil. When the escort reached the north and the grave was given its guard of silence, men rose from their mourning and saddled their ponies. Life and empire demanded motion. Ogdi would be confirmed by the Kuriltai. Talyui would steward the realm until then. Chagatai would speak with his customary sharpness, then keep faith. The sons of Joki, Batu among them, watched and waited for their place in the new order. Subutai unrolled mental maps. Yelu Chukai prepared his ledgers. In the west and south, rulers breathed, thinking the great storm had passed. They misunderstood what had been built. The assembly met in the late summer of 1229. Under the open sky, before elders, captains, and envoys from subject peoples, the sons of the founder took their places. Chaghatay's voice was direct and cutting. The sons of Jochi observed carefully. Talyui maintained order. The choice, prepared by their father and validated by years of war, was clear. Ogdiai's manner was open, a man who could feast deeply but also listen and find compromise. When the elders made their pronouncement and the ranks shouted as one, Ogdiai was lifted and declared the second great Khan. He began as a steppe leader should, with generosity. He opened the storehouses, distributing horses, robes, and belts to those who had served. Gifts flowed to allied tribes and distant vassals, declaring the center was strong enough to be open-handed. From this spirit and practical need, a capital rose, Karakoram, in the Orkhon Valley. It was not a city of stone in the Chinese manner, but a planned camp become town. Workshops, storehouses, and a timber palace carved by captive artisans took shape. A silver tree fountain crafted by a French silversmith poured wine, mare's milk, and mead for festivals, a symbol that useful talents from any land were welcome. Administration found a firmer footing. Yelu Chukai found in Ogdiai a ruler willing to listen. The scholar argued for household registers, fixed levies, and systematic taxation over endless seizure. He wanted a river of predictable revenue to feed the armies. Ogdiai agreed. He did not need to be loved by farmers. He needed their grain counted and delivered. Under this system, abuse did not vanish, but it became visible and punishable. The yam system grew into a continental web. Posts a day's ride apart, with fresh mounts and fodder, became the empire's nervous system. A message could leave Karakoram and reach North China in days. A traveler with a Pesa tablet moved under imperial protection. The roads themselves became the most durable invention, binding the realms together. The army did not idle. The campaign against the Jin resumed with grim focus. The Jin had retreated south, hoping distance would save them. In 1232, Mongol armies crossed the frozen Yellow River, their ponies sure on ice that cracked under heavier Jin cavalry. They used siege engines built by integrated Chinese and Khitan crews. At the Jin southern capital, fierce resistance met new terror, exploding gunpowder bombs and fire lances. Famine followed siege. In 1234, the Jin dynasty ended, consumed by Mongol persistence and the betrayal of their Song neighbors. That alliance with the Song proved fleeting. The Song soon learned the new masters of the north saw the border as a temporary line. But before the southern question could be settled, the west called louder. The lands granted to Jochi's descendants, the Ulus of Jochi, were a zone of immense opportunity. Batu, Jochi's son, emerged as its patient, capable leader. He had a large following and the rare ability to work with a genius like Subutai without envy. Subutai, his mind holding the maps from his earlier raid, proposed a campaign of staggering ambition to secure the western steppes, punish the rebellious Cumans, and probe the strange, forested kingdoms of Europe. Ogdiai approved. The muster was colossal. Princes from all family lines joined, sons of Ogdiai, sons of Talyui, sons of Chaghatai, and Batu leading the Jochid wing. This was not a horde. It was a coordinated invasion in multiple, separated columns that could strike like fingers of a single hand. Winter was their ally. They crossed frozen rivers, the ice serving as their bridge. The first blows annihilated the Volga Bulgars. Then they turned on the Cumans, scattering them westward. These fleeing Cumans poured into Hungarian lands, dragging the Mongol storm behind them. The princes of Rus, proud and divided, gathered in fractured councils. The Mongols did not wait for unity. They took city after city along the Volga and Oka rivers. When a town resisted, they brought up engines on sledges. When it yielded at first demand, they moved on, leaving a tax collector and a Darakachi. In the spring of 1241, one wing under Bidar and Katan swept into Poland as a diversion, to draw European forces away from the main target, the Kingdom of Hungary. At Legnica, they defeated a combined force of Polish knights and Teutonic brothers, using feigned retreat to shatter the heavy cavalry. The diversion worked perfectly. Meanwhile, Batu and Subutai forced the Carpathian passes through multiple routes, pouring into the Hungarian plain. King Bela IV assembled his host on a marshy island near the Sejo River, trusting a single bridge for defense. The Mongols, in a breathtaking feat of night engineering, built a second crossing in secret. At dawn, they attacked the main bridge with noise and fury while Subutai led a crushing flank attack over their hidden bridge. The Hungarian army was surrounded and annihilated at the Battle of Mohi. The plain was left thick with the fallen. The Mongols hunted remnants into Croatia and Dalmatia. Europe reeled, its rulers unable to comprehend an enemy that used winter as a weapon and built bridges in a night. Then, in December 1241, news crossed the Yam. Genghis Khan had died in Karakorum after a bout of heavy drinking. And with his death, the Mongol war machine, bound by its own laws, ground to a halt. The Yasa demanded that a new great Khan be chosen in a proper Kurultai. The princes in the west, including Batu and Gayuk, Genghis' son, were bound to return. Subutai argued for a winter thrust into the heart of Europe. The order from the center was unequivocal: withdraw. The army turned east, leaving a terrified Christendom to credit its salvation to angels, not to Mongol customary law. The empire now faced its first great succession crisis. The center trembled, then found steadiness in an unexpected place: the hands of women. Genghis' widow, Temüjin, took control as regent, skillfully maneuvering to secure the succession for her son, Gayuk. But another woman of profound intellect and influence was rising silently: Sorgatani, widow of Talyui and mother of Monk, Kublai, Hulagu, and Erik Bok. She secured the finest tutors for her sons, managed alliances, and navigated the treacherous politics with impeccable grace, all while the administrative machine her father-in-law had built continued to hum, moving taxes and orders along the indestructible Yam. The empire breathed, waited, and prepared for its next great chapter. The interregnum was a delicate dance of power and patience. Temüjin Khatun held the seals of regency for 5 years, skillfully using patronage and persuasion to weave a coalition for her son, Gayuk. In 1246, the Kurultai finally convened. Under the felt pavilions of Karakorum, Gayuk was elevated as the third great Khan. His reign was brief, forceful, and marked by a sharp temper. He aimed to centralize authority, cracking down on administrative abuses by the princes, which quickly bred resentment, particularly from his cousin Batu in the west. He drank heavily, as if racing against time itself, and in 1248, while preparing a campaign to confront Batu, he died on the march. The empire held its breath once more. Again, a woman stepped into the power vacuum. Gayuk's widow, Agil Kamish, assumed the regency but lacked the political deftness of Temüjin. The true gravitational pull began to shift toward the household of Talyui to the remarkable Sorgatani Beki. Through years of quiet diplomacy, superb management of her uppunnage, and the stellar education of her sons, she had prepared the ground. In 1251, after complex maneuvering, the Kurultai bypassed the line of Genghis and raised her eldest son, Monk, to the throne. Monk Khan was a ruler of a different mold: sober, diligent, and fiercely devoted to the administrative vision of his grandfather. He began with a purge of those who had exploited the previous regencies, executing corrupt officials and princes who had opposed his rise. He reaffirmed Yelu Chutsai's systems of census and taxation, bringing a new rigor to the empire's finances. He loved lists, accurate reports, and commanders who planned campaigns by the season, not by the raid. With the center consolidated, Monk opened 2 grand strategic fronts simultaneously. One door faced south, toward the Song dynasty, which still held the rich, populous heartlands of China. The other opened to the southwest, toward the remaining Islamic powers. He gave his brother Kublai a leading role in the southern theater and placed another brother, Hulagu, in command of a colossal army destined for the Middle East. Hulagu's campaign was an empire on the march. It included not only Mongol Tumans but also Chinese artillery experts, Armenian infantry, Georgian engineers, and Persian scouts. Their first major targets were the assassins, Nizari Ismailis, whose mountain fortresses in Persia had defied states for generations. One by one, using meticulous siegecraft and psychological pressure, the castles fell. At Alamut, the legendary Eagle's Nest, libraries were preserved even as the political structure was obliterated. From there, Hulagu turned to the grandest prize. Baghdad, the seat of the Abbasid Caliphate, a lighthouse of Islamic learning and power for 5 centuries. Caliph al-Mustasim, trusting in ancient prestige and divine favor, refused Hulagu's demand for submission. The siege began in January 1258. Mongol engineers ringed the city with catapults and mangonels. After a relentless bombardment, the walls were breached. The city was taken, and a terrible sack ensued. Chronicles speak of streets running with ink from destroyed libraries and blood from the slain. The last Abbasid caliph was executed, his death symbolizing the end of an era. The Mongol Ilkhanate took root in Persia. Power, however, always begets counterpower. In the north, Berk, Khan of the Golden Horde, the Jakidulus, had converted to Islam. The destruction of Baghdad, a revered Muslim city, horrified him. The familial bonds that once united the Chinggisid lines frayed and snapped. Berk formed an alliance with the Mamluks of Egypt, a slave soldier dynasty that had become Islam's foremost military power. In 1260, at the Spring of Goliath, Ain Jalut, a Mongol detachment under Kipuka, was lured into a trap by the Mamluk general Baybars and destroyed. The spell of Mongol invincibility in the region was broken. The Ilkhanate and the Golden Horde would slide into open war, cousin against cousin, a fracture that would never fully heal. Meanwhile, in the east, Monk Khan himself took personal command of the war against the Song. He orchestrated a massive, multi-pronged invasion. Yet, in 1259, while campaigning in Sichuan, Monk died, perhaps of dysentery, perhaps of wounds. His death was the catalyst for the empire's Great Schism. The news triggered a succession crisis that split the empire in two. Monk's younger brother, Kublai, commanding armies in northern China, learned of his death. So did another brother, Erik Bok, who was in Mongolia guarding the ancestral homeland. Kublai convened a Kurultai of his supporters in his Chinese domain and had himself proclaimed Great Khan. Erik Bok did the same in Karakorum, backed by princes suspicious of Kublai's growing Sinicization. A brutal civil war, the Talyuid Civil War, ensued, a war of messengers and supply lines, of desertions and sieges across the spine of Asia. Kublai, with control of the resources of North China and superior logistics, gradually strangled his brother's support. After 4 years of conflict, Erik Bok surrendered in 1264. He died in captivity soon after, possibly poisoned. Kublai was now the uncontested, though not universally accepted, Great Khan. But the unified empire of Genghis Khan was gone. The Golden Horde under Berk was independent and hostile. The Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia was often unruly. Kublai's authority was effectively supreme only in the east, over Mongolia, China, and the Ilkhanate, which remained a loyal ally. Kublai made a decisive and symbolic break. He moved his primary capital from the steppe to China, building a new city called Dadu, Great Capital, on the site of modern Beijing. In 1271, he declared a new Chinese-style dynasty, the Yuan, meaning origin or prime. He became a dual monarch, the Great Khan for the Mongols, the Emperor for the Chinese. He retained the decimal military system and Mongol traditions at court but embraced Chinese administrative models to govern the world's most populous state. His life's great military challenge remained, the conquest of the southern Song. This was a war not of steppes, but of rivers, canals, and fortified cities. The Song had a formidable navy, something the Mongols had never needed before. Kublai built one. He incorporated surrendered Song shipwrights and Korean sailors, creating a fleet that could fight on the great rivers and along the coast. The campaign was a slow, grinding push down the Yangtze River system, combining land assaults with naval blockades. The final act came in 1279. The last Song loyalists, with a child emperor, were cornered in a naval battle off the coast near Yamen. The Song ships were chained together to prevent desertion. The Mongol fleet, under the general Zhang Hongfan, attacked with fire and ferocity. When defeat was inevitable, the loyal minister Lu Xiufu took the young emperor in his arms and leaped into the sea, drowning them both. With that tragic, defiant act, the Song dynasty ended. For the first time in centuries, all of China was under a single ruler, and that ruler was a grandson of the steppe, a Mongol. Kublai's gaze now looked beyond the Middle Kingdom. He launched seaborne invasions of Japan in 1274 and 1281, only to have his fleets shattered by typhoons, the kamikaze or divine winds of Japanese legend. He sent armies into the jungles of Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Kampa, and Burma. They could win battles, take capitals, but they could not hold the humid, malarial lands. The geography itself defeated them. The empire had found its limits, not in human courage, but in climate and sea. Yet, within its vast, fragmented expanse, the legacy systems held. The Yam still carried messages between Karakoram, Dadu, Tabriz, and Sarai. The Pesa tablets still guaranteed safe passage. Merchants, now including Europeans like the Polo family, traveled with unprecedented security from the Mediterranean to the Pacific. The empire had become a network, a constellation of khanates linked by shared ancestry, commercial interest, and the ghost of a unified law. The vision of the boy from the Onon had scaled the world, and in its scattering had changed it forever. While Kublai ruled in Dadu, the other branches of the family tree grew into distinct, mighty realms, each adapting to its own soil. In the windswept west, the Golden Horde, descended from Joki, solidified its rule over the Russian principalities and the Pontic-Caspian steppe. Their capital at Sarai on the lower Volga became a bustling nexus of trade, where furs, wax, and slaves from the north were exchanged for silks, spices, and manufactured goods from the south and west. The Horde did not occupy Russian cities directly. Instead, they exerted control through a system of taxation and patronage. Russian princes had to journey to Sarai to receive the yarlik, the patent of rule, from the Khan. A prince like Alexander Nevsky of Novgorod learned to navigate this reality, accepting Mongol suzerainty to secure his own position against Western crusaders and rival princes. Over time, the Horde's rulers embraced Islam, and mosques rose beside the warehouses of Italian merchants from Genoa and Venice. The Golden Horde was a hybrid state, a steppe empire with riverine roots, its power echoing in the forests of Rus for centuries. To the south, in the lands of Persia and Iraq, Hulagu's Ilkhanate struggled with the aftermath of its violent birth. The destruction of Baghdad and the collapse of irrigation systems led to economic hardship and famine. But the Ilkhans, after initial resistance, began the work of reconstruction. Under rulers like Genghis Khan, who converted to Islam, the Ilkhanate actively revived agriculture, reformed coinage, and patronized Persian culture at splendid courts in Tabriz. The vizier Rashid al-Din, a physician of Jewish origin, compiled the Jami al-Tawarik Compendium of Chronicles, an astonishingly ambitious universal history that sought to weave together the stories of the Mongols, Chinese, Indians, and Muslims. At the Maraga Observatory, founded by Hulagu, astronomers like Nasir al-Din al-Tusi produced star tables that synthesized Greek, Persian, and Chinese knowledge. Even in ruin, the Mongol peace had sparked an unprecedented cross-pollination of ideas. Between these western states and the Yuan dynasty lay the often turbulent Chagatai Khanate, ruling over the cities of Transoxiana like Samarkand and Bokhara and the nomadic lands of Mogolistan. Here, Turkic and Mongol traditions blended uneasily. The Khanate became a cockpit for rivalry, particularly with the Yuan, as Chagatai princes like Kaidu, a grandson of Ogidi, waged a decades-long war against Kublai Khan, contesting control of Central Asia and the symbolic mantle of the true steppe tradition. Though politically fractured, the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace, fostered a connectedness across Eurasia that was utterly unprecedented. The roads were safe. The yam system, maintained by each khanate within its borders, allowed a letter to travel from Dadu to the Caspian in a matter of weeks. A Franciscan friar like William of Rubruck could journey from Constantinople to Karakorum, carrying letters from the King of France, and be heard by the Great Khan. The Venetian merchant Marco Polo could travel with his uncles across the entire expanse, serving in Kublai's administration for years before returning home with tales that would fire the European imagination. This connectivity was a highway for more than people and goods. It was a conduit for technology, art, and disease. Gunpowder, known in China for centuries, traveled westward along Mongol routes, transforming warfare in the Middle East and Europe. Persian and Chinese artistic motifs mingled in Ilkhanid miniature painting and architectural tilework. Medical knowledge crossed continents. A doctor in Tabriz might study a Chinese diagram of acupuncture meridians. Papermaking, printing techniques, and advanced astronomical instruments flowed from east to west. The very financial instruments of empire, like the paper money Kublai issued, backed by silver reserves, were noted with awe by travelers. But the pathways that carried silk and philosophy also carried invisible, deadly passengers. In the 1330s, a pestilence emerged from the rodent populations of the Central Asian steppe. Riding the caravan routes with unprecedented speed under the Pax Mongolica, it reached the Black Sea port of Kaffa, a Genoese trading post under Golden Horde control. From there, infected rats and fleas boarded ships bound for the Mediterranean. The Black Death, the bubonic plague, exploded into Europe in 1347. Within a few years, it wiped out a third or more of the continent's population. The interconnected world the Mongols had built had unwittingly unified the disease pool of Eurasia, with catastrophic consequences. No ruler had planned this. It was the dark, unintended side effect of a century of open roads. Back in the east, Kublai Khan's Yuan dynasty grew increasingly Chinese in its administration but remained aloof, a Mongol military aristocracy ruling a Han populace. Kublai himself became a figure of grand synthesis, a patron of Tibetan Buddhism, Chinese Confucianism, and steppe shamanism. He repaired the Grand Canal to feed his capital, promoted dramatic theater, and hosted envoys from across the world. Yet, the yuan faced perennial problems. Inflation from overissued paper currency, costly and failed foreign expeditions, and the inherent difficulty of a small nomadic elite governing a vast, sedentary civilization. After Kublai's death in 1294, the yuan saw a series of short-reigned, often dissolute emperors. The Mongols in China, like the Mongols elsewhere, gradually assimilated, but they never fully shed their separatist identity. Resentment festered among the Chinese scholar gentry, excluded from high office, and among the peasantry, burdened by corvée labor and taxes. Secret societies, like the White Lotus, nurtured millenarian dreams of rebellion. The unifying efficiency of the early Mongol state gave way to the familiar patterns of a dynasty in decline. Court factionalism, natural disasters interpreted as the loss of the mandate of heaven, and regional unrest. By the mid-14th century, the colossal empire founded by Genghis Khan existed only as a memory and a family legend. The yuan in China was crumbling. The Ilkhanate in Persia had dissolved into petty states in the 1330s. The Golden Horde and the Chagatai Khanate persisted but were often divided by internal strife. The symbolic unity of the Mongol world was gone. Yet, something profound remained. The borders drawn in the 13th century had permanently altered the political map of Asia. The experience of unified rule under the Pax Mongolica had forever changed the world's technological, commercial, and biological landscape. The idea of a universal empire, ruled by a singular law, lingered in the minds of conquerors who would come later, from Timur in Samarkand to the Mughals in India, all of whom would trace a sort of legitimacy back to the bloodline of the Great Khan. The storm from the steppe had passed, but it had scoured the earth and reshaped the channels in which history would thereafter flow. Let us step back now from the sweep of conquest and the fall of dynasties. Let us return to the essence of the man who began it all, and to the intangible legacy that outlasted the fracturing of his empire. For the memory of Genghis Khan was never just a list of battles or a map of borders. It became a force in itself, a current of ideas that flowed into the centuries that followed. The laws men called the Yasa were never a single book to be consulted. They lived in the spoken decrees, in the judgments of commanders, in the habits of obedience to a system that promised, above all, a stark and predictable fairness. Later courts would argue over its precise clauses, building whole commentaries on what they believed the founder had intended. But for the Mongols themselves, his words lived in stories, in the secret history of the Mongols, that unique epic transcribed in the years after his death. It gave an inner voice to the steppe, preserving the quarrels, the songs, the betrayals, and the loyalties in the Mongols' own tongue. It showed not just a conqueror, but a son, a brother, a man of fear and ambition and unwavering belief in the mandate of the eternal blue sky. Foreign chroniclers, Persian, Chinese, Armenian, wove his deeds into their own historical tapestries. To the Persian historian Juvayni, he was a necessary, if terrifying, instrument of divine will. To the Chinese officials serving the Yuan, he was a complex figure, a barbarian conqueror who nonetheless established a legitimate dynasty that could be recorded in the official annals. They agreed on certain core traits. He rewarded loyalty without regard for birth, he punished betrayal absolutely, he welcomed useful skill from any quarter, and he held the safety of envoys as sacred. This was the administrative and ethical kernel that survived. As the empire's political center of gravity drifted, from the felt tents of Mongolia to the marble halls of Dadu, from the pastoral court at Sarai to the learned atmosphere of Tabriz, each branch wore the Mongol inheritance in its own style. Yet a traveler moving between them would recognize common sights. The black tug banner of horsehair waving before a commander's tent, a yam station with fresh mounts and a clerk stamping a tablet, a merchant showing a worn pesa to pass through a toll gate without question, the universal understanding that to harm a messenger was to invite swift, terrible retribution. This was the most enduring invention, not the empire itself, but the idea of a connected, governed space. A space where commerce, communication, and even faith could travel under a guaranteed protection that transcended local warlords and petty banditry. The Mongol century created a template for continental interaction. It shrunk the world, proving that Europe and China were not separate planets but parts of a single, traversable landmass. The descendants of his bloodline ruled in disparate lands for centuries, often under different creeds. In China, the Yuan gave way to the native Ming dynasty in 1368, and the Mongols retreated to the steppe, fragmenting into competing groups. Yet they preserved the memory of their imperial past, and leaders like Dayan Khan and Altan Khan would later attempt to reunify the Mongol peoples in its name. In Central Asia, Timur, Tamerlane, though not a direct descendant, married into the line and fashioned himself as the restorer of the Mongol Empire, his campaigns echoing the scale and terror of his model. In India, his descendant Babur would found the Mughal Empire, another hybrid state that carried the Timurid, and thus a diluted Chinggisid legacy. In Persia, the legacy was more cultural than political. The Ilkhanate's patronage had fertilized Persian historiography, astronomy, and art. The idea of universal history espoused by Rashid al-Din was a direct product of the Mongol worldview. In Russia, the Tatar yoke left deep scars but also reshaped Muscovy's autocratic state structure and its strategic outlook, pushing it toward centralization to survive and eventually overthrow the horde's successors. And on the vast steppe itself, the homeland, the memory took on a sacred, elemental quality. Elders still made offerings on the slopes of Burkhan Khaldun, the sacred mountain that had sheltered the young Temüjin. They did not build a monument over the hidden grave. They carried him in ritual, in epic song, and in the very names they gave their children. He became a figure of nature, like the wind or the mountains. His name evoked starkly different emotions depending on where it was spoken. In settled societies from Hungary to Iraq, he was remembered as a scourge, a destroyer of cities, a figure of apocalyptic terror. In the folk memory of many cultures, he became the archetypal barbarian at the gate. Yet even there, a reluctant admiration sometimes seeped through, for his strategic genius, for his unwavering code, for the sheer, unimaginable scale of his achievement. Within the world he forged, however, a more nuanced legacy lived, where a judge under a Mongol-derived code allowed Buddhist, Muslim, and Christian to plead in the same court without fear. A strand of his vision held true. Where a caravan master from Genoa could plan a journey from the Crimea to Cathay based on known routes and expected security, his system still provided the ghost of a framework. Where a ruler from a steppe tent or a marble palace prized merit over noble birth, his revolutionary idea echoed. He had asked a simple, brutal question of the world he was born into. Why should a man's destiny be sealed by the clan he was born into? His answer, written in blood and law, was that it should not. That loyalty and skill were the only true currencies. This was the crack he hammered into the ancient edifice of hereditary aristocracy, a crack that would never fully close again. The empire fractured, the dynasties fell, the bloodline diluted. But the pathways remained. The idea that continents could be linked, that diverse peoples could be administered under a single, if harsh, system of order, that the world was wider yet more connected than anyone had dreamed, these were the seeds planted in the 13th century. They would lie dormant, then germinate in the age of exploration, when Europeans, dreaming of Cathay, would seek new routes to the riches the Mongol peace had once made accessible. In a very real sense, the voyage of Columbus was a direct result of the world Genghis Khan had revealed, a world whose unity he had imposed by force, and whose connections, once made, could never be entirely forgotten. So the story ends not with an empire, but with an echo. Not with a tomb, but with a template. The boy who learned to set snares on the frozen banks of the Onon had, in the end, set a snare for history itself. The wind that was his first teacher still blows across the grassland, carrying his name, forever entwined with the vast, silent sky. And so we find ourselves here, at the end of this long journey, under the same infinite sky that witnessed the rise of a world shaker. We began with a boy, abandoned and hungry, learning the brutal arithmetic of survival. We traced his path as he forged a new kind of brotherhood from loyalty, not blood, and with it, united a fractured people. We saw him become a Khan, then a conqueror, architecting a state that could move armies across continents and messages faster than the dawn. We watched his descendants scatter his legacy like seeds to the wind, some taking root in the palaces of China, others in the mosques of Persia, still others in the frosty rivers of Russia. The empire is dust. Karakoram's timbers have long since returned to the earth. The silver tree fountain is silent. The yam stations are buried by sand and grass. But what remains is more subtle, woven into the fabric of the world that came after. It is in the borders of nations, drawn by Mongol campaigns. It is in the ghostly trade routes beneath our modern highways and shipping lanes. It is in the very idea that East and West are not separate worlds, but connected halves of a whole, an idea proven by the painful, exhilarating unity of the Pax Mongolica. Think of the scholar in Moraga, adjusting a brass astrolabe under a Persian sky, his calculations informed by Chinese star charts brought by Mongol couriers. Picture the Venetian merchant in Dadu, bewildered and amazed by paper money and coal fires, his journals destined to inspire generations of explorers. Remember the Russian prince bowing in the golden tent at Sarai, a moment of humiliation that would forge a future empire's steely resolve. These are the fragments of the mosaic, the dispersed pieces of the world that Temüjin, the boy who became Genghis Khan, helped to assemble. His story is not a simple one of hero or villain. It is a story of profound duality. He was a unifier and a destroyer, a lawgiver who used terror as his scribe, a man of the steppe who mastered the siege engines of settled civilizations. He could show mercy to a skilled enemy like Jebe and order the utter erasure of a resistant city. He believed in a heaven that judged oaths, and he broke the oldest oath of his own youth when brotherhood collided with ambition. To understand him is to stand in that wind on the grassland, feeling both its life-giving freshness and its bone-chilling scourge. For us, listening now in the quiet dark, Perhaps the most lasting resonance is in the sheer, epic scale of human transformation. From the confines of a single felt tent to the rulership of a quarter of the globe, it is a leap that defies imagination. It speaks to the terrifying and awesome power of a single, unwavering will when it aligns with the currents of history. It is a reminder that the maps we take for granted are not fixed. They are drawn and redrawn by the dreams, the hunger, and the resilience of individuals. And what of the quiet moments? The shared cup of mare's milk at Baljuna, the taste of muddy water on the tongue that became a sacrament of loyalty, the private council of Borte in the lamplit tent, the aging Hoylan watching her grandchildren play, her memories holding the sharp taste of roots dug from frozen riverbanks. These are the human anchors in the storm of history, the reminders that even the greatest tides are made of individual drops, of love, loss, courage, and sacrifice. As the night deepens and your own mind begins to drift, let the images soften. Let the thunder of hooves fade into the whisper of the eternal steppe wind. See the unmarked grave, guarded only by silence and sky. Hear the simple echoing truth of his final lesson, that a ruler needs no monument of stone. His monument is the road, the law, the memory of order imposed upon chaos. His legacy is the undeniable proof that one life, however improbably begun, can bend the arc of centuries. Wherever you are listening, in whatever hour has found you, remember that you are part of a world shaped by such improbable stories. The connections that bring these words to you, the peace that allows this moment of rest, even the complex tapestry of nations you call home, all bear, in some faint, traceable way, the imprint of that distant century when the world became suddenly, violently, and irrevocably smaller. Thank you for allowing Sleepy Owl to be your guide on this journey through time. We traveled from the edge of survival to the pinnacle of power, and back to the quiet endurance of legacy. If this story has given you a moment of wonder, a spark of reflection, or simply a peaceful path into sleep, then our purpose is fulfilled. Good night.